Welcome everyone. My name is Stéphane Voisin. I'm in charge together with Peter Tankov of the Green and Sustainable Finance Research Program at Institut Louis Bachelier. And we are pleased to have you in this webinar organized in partnership with Finance for Tomorrow and I4C, and to present this alignment cookbook report, which has been sponsored by the French Ministry of Transition, Ecological Transition and Solidarity, and the WWF France. First, if you may, sorry.
We don't hear you, Stéphane. You cut off your mic.
Sorry. We will start with a few words from Peter Tankov to introduce this Green and Sustainable Finance Research Program that has been in charge of writing this report. And after, I will introduce the panelists. Peter, the floor is yours.
Yes, thank you, Stéphane. So just a few words to present our Green and Sustainable Finance Research Program. The head of the program is Pierre-Louis Lyons from Collège de France, and the operational day-to-day management is done by Stéphane and myself. And we also work closely with the data lab of Louis Bachelier Institute, headed by Louis Boulanger. So we do both more academic and more applied research on topics of like scenario analysis, impact measurement, modeling of climate-related financial risks, and also we have some projects related to ESG data. So we do both, we publish research papers, some more pedagogical material related to green and sustainable finance, and we also do more applied research. And the report that will be presented today is a good example of this type of activities. So I think this time I give the floor back to Stéphane.
Thank you, Peter. So I would like just to introduce you to the panelists, a very nice, equally gender balanced panel. First of all, Anne-Claire, CEO of Finance for Tomorrow, and she will speak, she will introduce this session. Clément Bultel from the Ministry of Energy Transition and Solidarity. Hugo first will speak from WWF, Head of Green Finance, and Alice from I4C. And last but not least, Julie will present the report. Anne-Claire, the floor is yours. Your mic is cut off, Anne-Claire.
Sorry, even after so many weeks on webinar and behind our screen, I always forgot to be unmuted. Anyway, thank you. So thank you, Stéphane, and thanks again to ELB for inviting me and to partner with Finance for Tomorrow on this event. So I'm Anne-Claire Roux. I'm the Managing Director of Finance for Tomorrow, which is the Green and Sustainable Finance Initiative based in Paris. And I'm really pleased to be virtually with you today. Well, for many reasons, because the first one is that we are always supportive of this kind of work and publication, which is very useful to improve the knowledge and to help market players to have tools to implement climate strategies and to align their portfolios. I think this is the first time such a kind of work have been done, and congratulations again to this very hard work to ELB and I4C and WWF, because it's again really useful, I think, for market players to have this kind of tool to study, to analyze, and to compare methods and framework to see how they can align their portfolio strategy with the climate objectives. The second reason is that I'm always really pleased to see collaboration between academics and private sectors, but also public public entities as the Ministry for the Ecological Transition and NGOs, because this is really also part of the DNA of Finance for Tomorrow to be a collaborative platform and to gather the diversity of players working on sustainable finance in Paris. And last but not least, and I won't be too long, but I would like also to strengthen that. I'm really pleased that this work is also part of the Finance Climate Project, which is really an important project financed by the European Commission in France. This is a kind of pilot project to implement a national strategy on sustainable finance. It will be financed during 5 years. It is led by ADEME, the French environmental agency, and Finance for Tomorrow is very honored and proud to be one of the 8 partners of this consortium. So that's also one of the reasons I think it's very important to have this kind of work and to showcase what we do in France. But this kind of work can be also, I think, very useful and share broadly internationally, not only in France. That's why also you will very pleased, I think, today to hear so many French accents in English, and we were thinking that it was useful to make this presentation English. So I just let the floor to the speaker. I thank you again for inviting me, and I really recommend all the participants to read this report and really to share it as much as possible.
Thank you, Anne-Claire. Clément, the floor is yours. Why this report?
Hello, everyone. My name is Clément Bultel from the French Ministry of Ecological Transition, which just changed its name yesterday, once again. I'm a Sustainable Finance Officer at the Ministry, working notably on non-financial reporting issues. So I will just introduce you by giving you some regulatory context elements on which this report integrates and why we wanted to support it, to support this work. So as I guess most of you know, since 2015 in France there is a regulatory requirements for some investors, not all, but just to summarize, insurance companies, asset managers and institutions for occupational retirement provisions on non-financial reporting. So it's the well-known Article 173 of the Energy Transition for Green Growth Act, on which there are specific requirements, notably on climate-related risk and implicitly alignment with the Paris Agreement, even though the Paris Agreement is not mentioned in the current implementation decree. The wording is a contribution of investors to long-term ecological and energy transition goals, but as this is the only long-term official goals in this area, this is a kind of an implicit mention. And as you know, these requirements were pioneering at the time and inspired many recent similar requirements at the European level, as you know, the work of the TCFD, etc. And recently, last year, the French Energy and Climate Law modified and deepened these requirements, notably by adding further investors to the scope, credit institutions and investment companies, and by adding also further specific requirements, notably on biodiversity risk, on how biodiversity risk are integrating into investment strategies. So at this stage, in conjunction with the Ministry of Economy and Finance, we will publish a new implementation decree by the end of the year 2020. And besides, there is now the EU disclosure regulation, which has been adopted last year at the end at the end of the year 2019, and which will enter into force next year in March. Again, for these requirements, some kind of a implementation decree, the regulatory technical standards on some article of the regulation will be published by the end of the year 2020. And we will try to, of course, harmonize at best the European and the French implementation texts and requirements to make it fit at best. So with regard to specifically to the EU regulation, we add to question the added value of the current French requirements. And what came out is that we really want to keep and deepen specific elements on the integration of ESG criteria into investment strategies, and specifically what is the current added value of the French requirements, elements on climate-related risk, both physical and transition, also legal and systemic, biodiversity risk, as it is now a new requirement, and of course strategy alignment with the Paris Agreement. So obviously we wanted to explore methodological issues related to these requirements, because we can see and it is absolutely obvious that these issues are integrated in a really heterogeneous manner by all stakeholders, and that there is maybe a need to deepen the regulation on this issue, or at least to be more precise on what is required to implement this kind of process, to integrate these kind of elements within your investment policies and strategies. So I will leave the floor now, but if you have any question later, I'll be pleased to answer. Thank you, Stéphane.
Thank you, Clément, and stay with us. Indeed, I'm sure there will be questions on the regulator intentions after this report. Hugo, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Stéphane, and hi everyone. I'm Hugo Bleuet from the WWF France, where I lead the green finance team. So the WWF sees globally finance as one of the means to achieve its goals, and especially its goals on climate, and has developed quite a lot of programs in this area. In the tools, let's say the jungles of tools that are available for financial institutions to drive their strategy on climate issues, the WWF considers that the ones that are forward-looking are a key part of these strategies, and that for the moment there are too few institutions doing this kind of analysis. And when they do it, some of the research we've carried out in the last years show that they do not do it in a consistent way, and especially the tools on aligning their portfolios with low carbon objectives or trajectories. They're not done in a consistent way, and that's a pity, because we really think that it's one of the key elements that would bring the financial institutions to contribute to the transition in a rightful and efficient manner. So we're very pleased to have partnered with the ministry, with I4C and the Institut Louis Bachelier on that. I cannot stress enough how much this work will be useful to the market. It's very, and we have to recognize the work that Julie has done here. It's very specific, very technical, and I know it will, really help financial institutions to ask the right questions when they're picking these kind of methodologies, and to implement them in a efficient way. So that's one of the goals of the study to me. It's better information and clarity brought to the market. I will not come back on the target and the objectives regarding the legislative framework that Clément just touched upon. And what it also shows is that there are a couple of methodologies and initiatives that are already in the market, and that for the moment they are not converging to the same building blocks. And that's maybe one knot we want to crack. Is it under which conditions do we can we wish that these different methodologies converge into the same way and of putting the problem, the same methodological blocks, the same data sets, the scopes, are they answering to the same questions, etc. And this report really brings, I think, some very, very high level and very specific answers. And without, just a teaser for what I guess Alice will touch upon is there will be a second report issued next semester. I mean, beginning of September or October, sorry, that will issue a couple of recommendations for both financial institutions and the French government and the EU on how could we, make this convergence happen, or under which conditions. And this is, I guess, also one super interesting piece of work that we're contributing to, and so I'm very happy again to see you all here attending to this webinar. And thanks again to I4C, the Ministry, Institut Bachelier, and also Fine for Tomorrow that helps us disseminate this important piece of work. Thanks.
Thank you, Hugo. And that was indeed a good transition to Alice's speech. The floor is yours, Alice.
Thank you very much, Stéphane, and hello everyone. I hope you can hear me well. So before we start the in-depth presentation of temperature alignment approaches, I will provide just a few introductory remarks highlighting the context in which these approaches can be used. So I4C has been associated to this work after the release of a discussion paper in 2019 presenting a framework for financial institutions to align with the Paris Agreement. As many of you may know, the concept of alignment emerged in response to the Paris Agreement, which was adopted in 2015 and really reframed climate action from a focus on the near-term incremental increase of adaptation and mitigation actions to emphasize the need for a long-term transformation of economies and societies around three objectives: the objective of decarbonizing economies, the objective of adapting economies, and the objective of redirecting finance flows. Yes, exactly, thank you. So in addition, this agreement really relies on a bottom-up and dynamic approach, which means that the pathway towards achieving these three objectives of the Paris Agreement is to be defined by country-led national pathways to simultaneously achieve both climate but also broader sustainable development objectives. Since the adoption of the Paris Agreement, financial institutions and other economic actors have taken commitments to align with the Paris Agreement. However, until very recently, there was no definition of what this commitment means. And this is the reason why I4C issued last year this discussion paper in which we present that this commitment is to be understood as a commitment to align all activities of one institution with the three goals of the Paris Agreement and the associated bottom-up process agreed to by national governments in 2015. So if you can just click. So what does it imply in practice? So I4C discussion paper proposed a framework that specifies three dimensions that all Paris alignment approaches should take into account. First, economic actors and financial institutions that would like to be Paris aligned should adopt a comprehensive scope of action and really seek to directly or indirectly support low GHG climate resilient development across all business areas. And they should really take into account broader systems and value chains. Second, they should prioritize actions that are consistent with both near-term climate objectives, but also long-term goals, and really make sure that they do not contribute to carbon lock-in or to maladaptation. And third, they should seek as much as possible to best contribute to the goals of the agreement. Of course, the scale of contribution of financial institutions will vary from one institution to another, as institutions may be involved in different types of business lines that have impact-oriented objectives or more commercial objectives. However, a commitment to Paris alignment is a commitment to adopt the high level of ambition that is embodied in the Paris Agreement. So if we can go to the next slide, what does it imply? This implies that first, institutions should hold support for non-consistent activities to ensure that all of their activities are consistent with long-term goals. And second, if you can click, institutions should determine and really act on how they can best leverage their potential to support low GHG climate resilient transformations in countries and sectors of operation. So if you can click again, thank you, Stefan. This means that they should seek, whenever possible, to contribute to both incremental but also transformative changes to achieve all three objectives of the agreement: the objective of decarbonizing economies, adapting economies, and redirecting finance flows. Sorry, if you can go to the next slide. So doing this in practice will require financial institutions to integrate these considerations into their strategies and operational frameworks and procedures for decision-making and investments. So as you can imagine, Paris alignment approaches will thus require a combination of different procedures, tools, and instruments. And among the different methodologies that were developed over the past few years, portfolio temperature alignment methodologies have gained a lot of interest from practitioners, but also from regulators, as was mentioned by Clément and Hugo earlier. So these methodologies were developed to assess the compatibility or consistency of an asset or a portfolio with a given trajectory limiting temperature rise under a specific level. So this measure should above all make it possible to really reflect on what a 2-degree compatible economy and finance should look like. To date, these methodologies only focus on one of the three objectives of the agreement, the objective of decarbonizing the economy, but very often with a top-down approach and not the bottom-up country-led approach promoted in the Paris Agreement. None of them really guarantee that an entire portfolio can do no harm, as per the previously mentioned criteria, nor do they assess really the level of contribution of this same portfolio. However, in combination with other tools, instruments, and measures, these assessment approaches may be very useful to provide financial institutions with a forward-looking and portfolio-wide outlook. So I will now let the floor to Julie to present the in-depth review of these methodologies. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Alice. And indeed, there is no landmark cookbook without a master chief. And as Hugo said, she spent about 3 months in the jungle and she's back with us. Here is Julie. She will give you a detailed flavor of the menu today.
Great. Hi, everyone. Thank you, Stéphane, and thank you for all the speakers. So I'm Julie Reynaud, a member of the ELB network, and I'm very happy today to be presenting you some of the key conclusions and findings of the Alignment Cookbook. So as mentioned by the previous speakers today, the reason for writing this cookbook is that we noticed an increasing number of methodologies, tools, and methods that seek to measure the alignment of companies and portfolios with a temperature trajectory. And we noticed as well that the transparency levels around those methods and hypotheses taken by those methods is not always optimal and makes it very difficult for financial actors to compare those methodologies between each other and choose the most appropriate to their needs. So this is the reason why we wrote the cookbook. How do I... Oops. So the cookbook is a very long report. We do not expect anyone to read it from page 1 to 180, but it's been written with two audiences in mind. The first part of the cookbook is targeted to decision makers that wish to understand a bit more what are these tools and what are the specific methods that go into building those tools. So it's technical, but not as technical as the second part, which is focused on practitioners. And the aim of the second part is really to go deep into the details of the different ingredients of building such methodology. So the report ultimately study, analyze, and compare the methods and frameworks available today to investors who wish to measure the alignment of their investment portfolio with a temperature trajectory. And there is, of course, a specific focus on those methods that express the results of the assessment into an implied temperature rise or a temperature metric. So, as mentioned by Alice from I4C earlier, in this specific report, we define assessment methodologies as a mathematical measure of the proximity between the climate performance of a portfolio, which can be expressed through a range of indicators: carbon footprint, green-brown shares, climate scores, anything else you name it, on the one hand, and on the other hand, one or several temperature benchmarks that are chosen or taken from one or several trajectories in a given scenario over a defined period of time. So, of course, a multitude of metrics are available to investors who wish to measure the climate performance of their portfolio. Carbon footprinting and green-brown share, for example, are the most used at the moment at portfolio level. However, as everyone knows, those metrics are not sufficient to make a dynamic and a qualified assessment of the sufficiency or insufficiency of the portfolio performance with regards to the long-term global temperature objective. So, for example, is a portfolio invested, let's say 20% in so-called green companies? Is this enough to be considered aligned in the context of climate goal? Or a portfolio that has a lower carbon footprint relative to its benchmark, again, is it enough? So temperature alignment approaches has been developed to assess the compatibility of portfolios with the temperature rise limitation goal, resulting in indicators that prospectively, dynamically measure what too much carbon emissions or not enough green activities mean at the level of a company or a portfolio. In this family, we can note, for example, at company level, the approach of the Transition Pathway Initiative or the methods that have been put forward by the Science Based Targets Initiative to help companies set up targets. And at investor level, most data providers have developed their own method. We have counted 11 of them so far on the market. And of course, many investors have been working very hard to develop their own approach in-house. So there is a range of methods and approaches that are being developed at the moment. So now that we have better defined what we mean by temperature alignment methodologies, let's explore what it can be used for. So the first key message is that, as Ali said, temperature alignment assessments are not an end or sufficient in themselves. As presented by I4CE, aligning the activities of a financial institution to the Paris Agreement is a much wider process that needs to happen at both the strategic and operational levels. So temperature alignment methods, they are one piece of the puzzle that can support the alignment strategies of investors. So many of you are working on this topic, for example, through a number of organizations and coalitions that each tackle different parts of this wider alignment process, whether it is, for example, target setting with the Science-Based Targets Initiative for financial institutions, on strategy with the CA100, for example, or methodologies with the work of the Net Zero Asset Owner Alliance, the TCFD, IIGCC, and others. So as mentioned earlier, the focus of the alignment cookbook of this report is on assessment method. In this report, we do not make a judgment or discuss alignment strategies. We really focus on the methods. So these approaches can be seen as one of the multiple tools that are available to investors today to both set up and monitor the results of an alignment strategy, amongst, of course, a number of other approaches and indicators that already exist and that are yet to come. So now that we have situated where this type of approaches fit and can be useful in the wider financial sector alignment process, let's get technical. For those who know me, you know it's my favorite part. And discuss a little bit the recipe and ingredients of this type of methods. So we discussed with a lot of people in writing this report, with a lot of experts and data providers and organizations. So I really want to thank everyone that took the time to participate to this process. And we concluded that every temperature alignment methodologies follow, broadly speaking, the same general recipe, which comprises of 4 general steps. So the first step is, of course, to measure the climate performance of the company or the portfolio. As I mentioned earlier, this can be done through a wide variety of metrics, carbon footprinting, green-brown share, climate scores, anything, you name it. The second step is to choose one or several scenarios to which the climate performance of companies and portfolios will be compared. The third step is to convert the decarbonization trajectories that are given from the chosen scenarios in step 2 to temperature alignment benchmarks that are applicable to the specific companies or sectors or portfolios under consideration. And of course, the last step is to put step 1 and step 3 together to perform the alignment analysis and express the results. So the results can be expressed through a wide variety of metrics, but as I mentioned earlier, in this specific report, we have a more specific focus on those methods that translate the result of alignment analysis into a temperature metric. The results are aggregated at portfolio level, either at step 1, before the alignment analysis is performed, or after step 4, when the alignment analysis at company level has been performed. So we have noticed both approaches in our review of methodologies in the market. So these are the 4 main general steps of the recipe, but of course, within each of these steps, there are many, many, many methodological choices that can be made. So often, we make the distinction between temperature alignment approaches by technology or by greenhouse gas emissions. For example, we find this distinction in the TEG Climate Benchmark report. But our conclusion from the review of those methods is that there are many more possible differences between those approaches. The devil is in the details. So of course, how do you define portfolio climate performance, but also what metric and what perimeter should be used? How do you choose the scenario and the reference trajectory? Do you measure alignment at a specific point in time, for example, 2025 or 2030, or do you try to measure it dynamically, cumulatively through time? How do you express the results, etc., etc.? So on this slide, you can see all the different methodological choices that we noticed in our review. And of course, these are discussed in much wider detail in the report. So many permutations of the same recipe is possible. So it's possible to imagine as many temperature alignment approaches as the number of possible combinations between the methodological choices that were listed on the previous slide. And on this slide, I just wanted to show you a subset of the specific assessment question some of the methods suggested by methodological providers help answer. And you can see that even if we classify all those methods into the same bucket, into the same family, actually the range of methodological choices that can be made within each steps of the recipe leads all those methodology to answer very different assessment questions. So of course, we will see later how this impacts practically the results on a given portfolio. For now, this yields the question, is there a recipe which is more relevant than another? Or is there a question that is more relevant than another? That's the $1 million question. And I will take the risk to disappoint you today. There is no ideal temperature alignment methodology to date. And what we say in the report is that it is up to the users of those methodologies that understand and choose the method that best fits their information needs. And it is also up to the regulators to become more precise on what minimum technical requirements those methodologies should follow in order to be considered fit for purpose. So as mentioned, today there is a lack of clear and common definition. What alignment with a temperature trajectory means for a portfolio, it remains unclear. Beyond the general definition I of course highlighted a bit earlier. Not only the characteristics of such assessments are not well defined, but the reference points is not as well. But of course, as I already mentioned, and as you all know, there are a number of coalitions and organizations that are working on the topic at the moment, including the Net Zero Asset Owner Alliance, the TCFD, the Institutional Investor Group on Climate Change, the Science Based Targets Initiative for Financial Institutions, and others. And as mentioned as well a bit earlier, I4CE and the Institut Louis Bachelier will publish a second report in the autumn that will examine the feasibility of introducing minimum requirements for the use of such metrics on temperature alignment methodologies, but not only, extending the range to other type of methodologies such as climate, transition risk, and physical risks. So in the alignment cookbook, we still start exploring some of the characteristics that we believe to be key to this type of assessments, especially if this type of assessments are made in relation to the temperature objective of the Paris Agreement. But one key message is that it is very important to understand and to consider the range of trade-offs that methodology developers face because of data availability. So what is best from a theoretical perspective may not be easily applicable in practice today with our current state of knowledge and data disclosure. So let's explore a little bit those trade-offs. So the first one, the famous and infamous Scope 3. So as many of you know, emissions within the value chain, or Scope 3 emissions, represent the largest share of a company total emission for a large number of sectors. And investment decisions based on methodologies that rely only on Scope 1 or 2 emissions may lead to an increase in total emissions by displacing them along the value chain. So for this reason, in our view, it is recommended that for sectors where it is the most relevant, temperature alignment assessments take into account value chain emissions. So this is the case for the oil and gas and automobile manufacturer sector, for example, but also for other sectors where it is a bit more difficult to do so. For example, the food and bev sector, banks and financial institutions sector, and others. Of course, as many of you know and will say, data availability and quality, although it's been increasing in the last few years, it has historically been very low. And in the context of temperature alignment assessments, there is an added difficulty, which is the availability of decarbonization benchmarks that apply to the specific sector and scope under consideration, and often these are missing. So in reviewing methodology developer strategies to mitigate this trade-off, we have seen a number of strategies. So some methodology developers decide to build additional models and scenarios and take additional hypotheses to be able to take scope 3 emissions into account for those sectors where specific decarbonization trajectories are not available. Other methodology developers have made the choice to exclude scope 3 at the moment and wait until the data and decarbonization trajectories become available. And other methodology developers have decided to apply a sector agnostic, so a general economy-wide decarbonization rate to the totality of carbon emissions, scope 1, 2, and 3 of the companies and sectors under operation. Second trade-off, forward-looking data. So as you know, there is a disconnect between the time horizon embedded within climate models, international climate treaties and national climate plans, investment horizons for different asset classes, and of course, the reporting of forward-looking data by businesses. So temporality is a key concept, is a key point, in the concept of alignment. It's its raison d'être, as we mentioned at the beginning. A portfolio can be aligned with a 2-degree trajectory on the short term, but when you take a long-term perspective, it may not be aligned. So temporality is key. The problem is that few companies report on forward-looking data, and when they do, it is often not on a consistent or comparable basis. And in addition, the further the perspective or the time horizon you take, the more uncertain the estimation of the future climate performance of a company or portfolio is. So in the report, we review the different types of forward-looking data that we have identified and the pros and the cons and the types of sources that can be used. And we have identified, for example, company-level decarbonization targets, revealed plan and CapEx, and extrapolation. And each of these forward-looking data answer a slightly different question. So in our review of the methodology developer strategies, in assessing future climate performance of companies and emissions, we've noticed quite a few. So a number of methodology developers have decided not to include forward-looking data and compare the climate performance of companies and portfolio today with what it should be at a specific point in time in the future, let's say 2030, to estimate the gap between the performance today and where it should be in the future. Other methodology developers rely on targets and they assess the implied temperature in companies' reported decarbonization targets. So this is a very specific research question. Other methodology providers use extrapolation, and this answers the question, if the company or portfolio continues on the same path as in the past, where are we headed? And finally, a number of methodology developers use a combination of those methods, so targets, extrapolation, asset level data, to triangulate all the sources and try to estimate as well as possible the most likely future climate performance of companies and portfolio. Now, for the third trade-off, the choice of scenarios. So as you know, a multitude of decarbonization trajectories lead to the same temperature outcome. A scenario is a plausible representation on an uncertain future, and it's also a story on how to reach that future. And the associated trajectories from these scenarios depend on a wide range of parameters and hypotheses. So two different trajectories that lead to a 2-degree or well below 2-degree world from two different scenarios, they will be different in terms of sectoral and time allocation of the remaining global budget. And so they will have different shape, and this will influence the results of the analysis. So the choice of one or several scenario and associated trajectory depends on a range of conceptual and practical considerations. So a precautionary approach would dictate that we use scenarios that peak sooner rather than later, that are more ambitious in terms of decarbonization, and that rely as little as possible on carbon removal. The issue is that methodology developers are often limited by practical considerations. The trajectories issued from those scenarios are expressed at different levels of temporal or geographical or sectoral granularity. So in practice, most methodology developers and investors use the scenario that provides them with the best data in terms of granularity for the perimeter chosen, rather than the scenario that will conceptually best answer the assessment question. Another thing to note is that third-party derived scenarios, such as those of the IEA or the IPCC, they were not developed to support portfolio temperature alignment. So it's normal that the scope, the focus, or the outputs of those scenarios, they are not suited perfectly to be used directly in those temperature alignment assessments. So in light of this challenge, data providers and investors have used a range of strategies to adjust the trajectories given by those scenarios or derive new ones. And it's important to note that adjusting or combining third-party derived trajectory can raise consistency questions. So for example, as I mentioned earlier, scenarios and trajectories that lead to the same temperature rise limitation objective, they can have different shapes and different assumptions built in, for example, in terms of the GDP hypothesis used in the scenario. And this is important because in a scenario, all the variables are linked. So if you use one trajectory from one scenario to assess one sector, on the one hand, and another trajectory issued from another scenario to assess another sector, in practice, it may not lead to comparable results. So it's important to discuss and ensure the consistency of trajectories when several scenarios are used and combined, and more research is needed in this area. Finally, the last trade-off we discussed in this presentation, but there are many more in the report, is the challenge as to how to take into account company specificities while ensuring that the macro level remaining carbon budget is respected. So as I mentioned, temperature and decarbonization trajectories distribute across time and sectors the remaining carbon budget, and if this carbon budget is surpassed, temperatures are likely to increase by more than 2 degrees by the end of the century. And then these decarbonization trajectories, they need to be distributed across micro-level actors, whether they are companies or portfolio. So we have a global cake. This cake is distributed through time, geographies, and sectors. And then it is further distributed amongst the different actors in those geographies and sectors. So the issue is, how do we distribute this cake? And at the highest level, there are two ways of doing this. So the first approach is to apply a reduction rate to all companies and portfolio, sector, or geographies. So this, for example, is to say that if global emissions need to decrease by 3 degrees per year in absolute terms to limit temperature rise below 2 degrees, then all companies should reduce their emissions by 3%, regardless of their starting point, to be considered 2 degree aligned. The second approach is to say that all companies within a given sector must reduce their emission intensities to a common value. They should converge to this common value. And of course, again, this value is dictated by the decarbonization trajectories as given by scenario. So the difference between those two approaches is shown on the graph on the left of this slide. So using the first approach, the one that applies the same decarbonization rates to all companies, it does not take into account the starting climate performance of companies. So a company that is very carbon intense today will have to reduce as fast and as much as a low carbon company today. So you can understand that this approach may not be considered very fair, especially by the low carbon company. Yet this approach is the only one applicable to companies and sectors where no specific decarbonization pathway is available. And so if you want to cover as many sectors as possible in your portfolio assessment, you may have to use this approach. The second approach that says that all companies within a given sector must converge to the same level at a given point in time. So it's applicable only to sectors where a specific decarbonization pathway exists. Of course, we cannot expect an oil and gas company to converge to the same level as a media company in 2030, for example. So it's really a sector-specific approach. And in addition, the decarbonization benchmark needs to be expressed in intensity terms, because we cannot expect two companies of different size to converge to the absolute carbon emission. The issue is that methodologies that use intensity-based benchmarks, so carbon emissions per unit of production or carbon emissions per unit of economic value, such as revenue, it does not guarantee that the overall budget is respected. So for example, if the actual company production or revenue growth is higher than that which is embedded in the scenario to calculate the intensity decarbonization benchmark, even if the company has the right intensity to be considered 2-degree aligned, it does not guarantee that the absolute remaining carbon budget will be respected. So here again, there is a trade-off between coverage, method availability, and taking into account sector and company specificities. So the results of such assessments can be expressed in a wide variety of metrics, but the one that has been gaining momentum recently is the implied temperature rise metric. And on this graph, you can see how this metric can be derived. I will not enter into the detail, but everything is explained in the report. A large number of investors use this metric for exploratory purposes. But one can argue that this metric is interesting because it is easy to communicate to a wide range of stakeholders by creating a graphic system of equivalency with the international temperature rise limitation objective. But the question is, in its current state today, is it really a useful metric? Well, there are several things to note. The first thing is that there are multiple layers of uncertainties that compound themselves at each step of the temperature alignment assessment. I like to call this type of assessments lasagnas. It's multiple layers, and at each layer there are uncertainties, and they just accentuate each other. If you think about it, there are uncertainties in measuring the climate performance of companies, in measuring the forward-looking data, in choosing the scenario, the uncertainties embedded in the scenario, in calculating the decarbonization benchmark, etc., etc. So this calls into question the desirability of translating the results of such an assessment into a single metric that may give a false sense of certainty to the uninformed reader. Second, it is worth recognizing that these type of approaches are quite simplistic in comparison to the IPCC climate models and approaches. So in the best case, the system of equivalency is approximate. In the worst case, it is misleading. The third point is to note that this type of metric, is it really informative? Is it really actionable? Oh, Stefan. Oh. I have a problem with your, sorry for this. So is it really actionable? So the extent of the overshoot or undershoot above a benchmark that, that represents a desired temperature trajectory might be more actionable than the temperature metric itself, because it will highlight the extent to which the emissions need to be reduced or green activities expanded for a portfolio to be considered 2-degree aligned. And then last but not least, the results across those methods are not necessarily comparable, again, because a lack of common definition in the face of the methodological trade-offs I explained earlier. And so let's review this issue of comparability now. So to test this, we decided to take two indices, the EURONEXT Low Carbon 100 and the SBF 120 in 2 different years. And we invited data providers that I really want to thank at this stage because they really played the game and were very collaborative to provide us results on those 2 indices. We chose the EURONEXT Low Carbon 100 because of its diversified sector composition, its focus on large cap, its French and European focus, and especially the combination of low carbon strategies in it. So the pocket of green companies, or companies that derive more than 50% of their revenue from green activities, the fossil fuel exclusion, and the use of best-in-class climate scores that take into account scope 1, 2, 3, and avoided emissions. So let's take a look at the results. So this is the main table, the main results. And don't try to read it. It is very hard to read, and it is on purpose. And this is to show that it is difficult to compare the headline results of each method directly. Indeed, the data coverage is highly variable from one method to another. Second, each method has different perimeters, assumptions, and use different indicators. A number of methods actually disclose several indicators. So for all these reasons, the results are very, very difficult to compare across different methodologies for the same index. On this graph, we mapped the result versus the 2-degree benchmark, which is the blue line in the middle. So the green dot represents the low carbon 100, and the blue dot represents the SBF 120. And here again, you can see the wide dispersion and variability in the results for the same indices over different methodologies. So all the methods still found that the SBF 120 is not aligned with a 2-degree trajectory. But the results were much more variable for the low carbon 100. So most methods found that the best index in terms of alignment is the low carbon 100 in 2019. It's the second column on that table. So that's reassuring. What is less reassuring is the results for the low carbon 100 2018. And here you can see that a number of methods find that it's the best index in terms of alignment, and a number of methods find that it is the worst. So why is that? So of course we do not have the full answer, but one of the reasons for the disagreement over the low carbon 100 2018 is because the low carbon 100 2018 has a 3% position in Veolia. And Veolia is the least consensual company in our data sample across all the different methods. Why is that? Well, first, because Veolia, as you know, is split into 3 businesses. And for 2 of its businesses, water and waste, there are no sector-specific decarbonization benchmark. So this is it's quite difficult to assess Veolia for this reason with the current scenario and data at hand. Second, a large share of Veolia Scope 1 emissions, over 30% in 2018, comes from methane. And most methodology developers, for simplicity and data granularity reason, use the IEA scenario. And IEA scenarios are expressed in carbon. So what do? You compare the climate performance of a company, which is expressed in greenhouse gas emissions, where a large part comes from methane, to a decarbonization trajectory, which is only expressed in carbon. So of course, it will not help the performance of the company. Third, Veolia had a science-based target validated in October 2019, and a number of methodologies do not take that into account, or in some databases, there is a lag between the announcement of the science-based target and the inclusion into the methodology. And finally, most methodologies do not capture Veolia's activity that contribute positively to the energy and ecological transition. So in a nutshell, the example of Veolia shows that with the current data availability and state of knowledge, in the face of the different trade-offs I discussed earlier, the different choices that methodology developers make can lead to very different results that can translate to very different results at index level when the index is invested a large part into that specific company. On this slide, where it was possible, we tried to show the dispersion in temperature score amongst the methods reviewed. And here again, we see that different methodology developers have different minimum temperature and maximum temperature. It goes as low as 0.5 and goes as high as 6 degrees in terms of dispersion. And we can also see that on the same sample, here it's the low carbon 100 2019, the median and the average temperature are quite different. Then on this slide, we were curious to understand whether the fact that an index or portfolio is invested in companies with a committed or validated science-based target, does it actually influence the results? So based on the Science-Based Targets Initiative data from April 2020, over 35% of the companies by count in the low carbon 100 have a set science-based target. So we tried to compare this data point, which is the yellow bar on this graph, to the percentage of company by count that have a 2 degree or less score in the different methods we looked at. And we found that most methods find a higher number of companies that have at least a 2 degree score than the number of companies with a validated science-based target as of 2020. And we also find that the overlap between companies with a validated science-based target and that are considered aligned with a 2 degree or well below degree trajectory in each method, the overlap is not perfect. And this is normal because even though there are a number of methodologies that automatically assign a 2 degree or less score to companies with a validated science-based target, there are a number of companies that do not take the validated science-based target for granted and try to cross data sources, and therefore in those methodologies, even if the company has a validated science-based target, it does not mean that it will be automatically a 2 degree or less aligned company. And then finally, we tried to perform correlation analysis between the different methods. So it's important to take those results with care because the sample size is often very small. So this is an area that will necessitate much more research, but we still found it interesting to show you the results. And we find that overall, there is little or even negative correlation between most of the methods. But we can still highlight a few points. So we find that generally speaking, the methods that share common methodological attributes seems to be better correlated with each other than others. So methods that, for example, include scope 1, 2, 3 emissions and that seek to capture the positive contribution of companies to the ecological and energy transition, often those methods that share these characteristics are quite, well, let's say relatively well correlated. We also find that methods that rely only on scope 1 and 2 in the assessment and do not take scope 3 into account are well correlated with each other. We also find a higher correlation between the methods that look at alignment cumulatively, so between T and T plus N, for example, between 2020 and 2050, compared to methods that look at alignment at only a specific point in time year, let's say 2030. So this analysis, even with all the caveats I mentioned at the beginning, shows that in practice, the different methodological choices that methodology providers make in the face of the trade-offs I described earlier can have a significant impact on the overall data set. So the key messages to conclude the presentation. So number one, there is a lack of clear and transparent methodological framework for temperature alignment assessments. So we really need to work on this one. At the moment, it's more of an art rather than a science. And this is why the wide range of methods that exist can yield very different results to the same portfolio. And within the current state, even if the implied temperature rise metric could be considered an interesting option for communicating the results, it is still very important to be very transparent and to be aware of the many limitations that are embedded within this type of metric. So I will stop here. I already talked too much, and I will let Stéphane moderate any questions you may have. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Julie. And thanks again for this very exhaustive presentation. We already have a few questions on the chat box, and one of them was about using the carbon delta methodology. I think I answered this one. We reviewed the historic carbon delta methodology, but they did not take part of the test for the reason I explained in the chat room. The second question, a bit more technical. So would you expect more relative dispersion in the end, given the very different approaches across vendors and even some negative correlations?
So yes, indeed. And as the correlation graph shows, there are some negative correlation. And unfortunately, it was not possible to test further, why, what can explain those negative correlations. So this is an area for further research that should be quite interesting. But it's true that the fact that the Low Carbon 100 2019 came out as the best index in all methodologies, even if they have all different scope and perimeter, was quite reassuring. But then when we looked at the Low Carbon 100 2018, we realized that it might just be by luck that all those methods were agreeing, rather than something that could be reproduced indefinitely.
Yes, as you can see, we are sharing our screen with Julie's a very old-fashioned way. There are questions. There is a question for Hugo, I understand. You mentioned it's a pity that methodology are not consistent with one to another, but it's normal and actually great to have innovation and diversity to progress on Paris alignment assessment. Do we need a consensus there, or should we be happy to get the diversity, Hugo?
Stéphane?
Yes.
Yes, I'm sorry, I didn't get the question on the chat box.
Now the question is that it's mentioned that there was you mentioned that it was a pity to have such a heterogeneity in methods, but with the comment says it's normal because we are at the beginning of the process, and we should be happy to get also a diversity of methods to foster innovations, basically. So, maybe should we be happy to have no consensus yet?
Yeah, indeed. I mean, this is one way of looking at it, because as Julie very rightly said, for the moment there's no consensus and no method that is technically perfect. So it's good to have some competition between methodology providers. So by improving yet and yet these methodology and addressing the technical issues. Hopefully one day we will come at something which matches all the challenges. But my remark was more in the sake of time. We know that there's very little time yet remaining for aligning our economies with the Paris Agreement, and that financial institutions, given their huge role and the power that they have in influencing the way the economy will transition, I'm also thoughtful of when will they have the right tools and the right understanding on how they can best influence. That was my point.
Clément, do you want to complement that? It's also, I think you mentioned it, it's a matter of comparability as well, but maybe you want to give a word?
Yes, well, why not? Indeed, I fully agree with what Hugo just said, but maybe even though on the correlation issues and comparability issues, there will still be some gaps. It will obviously be idealistic to reach a perfect methodology, a perfect standard, but still, if we manage to reach to some minimal standards, for example, in terms of on the time horizon of some underrated estimation in the climate scenarios used by the vendors, we will be able to limit the heterogeneity. But I don't know how far the debate is on the hands of the vendors themselves or the regulators. My opinion is both, but the trade-off are really difficult to assess at this stage.
Okay, thank you, Clément. There's a good lineup of questions, but you can also raise your virtual hands. I remember you. Julie, what would you recommend as an alternative to implied temperature?
So one indicator that I find interesting, and that is related to implied temperature, is just the indicator before, is the amount of carbon emissions that is over or under the temperature benchmark. Because this also gives you a relative sense of the distance of the portfolio climate performance relative to the benchmark, and it tells you by how much, and it just doesn't go the extra step of saying, well, that overshoot or undershoot in carbon emissions translates into this temperature, because this additional step comprises of many uncertainties as well, as I mentioned. So this percentage overshoot under or over the benchmark, I think is quite interesting. And I mentioned carbon emissions, but it can also be, in green-brown share or in scores, whatever the metric you choose to measure climate performance. So this can be an interesting metric, at least to complement the implied temperature rise metric. We could have both in a given report.
Another questions on company's target. I mean, just can ask the questions. Did you test the credibility of the SBTi process? Meaning, did you test how companies with target SBT validated have actually achieved targets?
I would love to do that. But it was not possible, just because the time series are not available to be able to do this test in a sufficiently robust way. However, I can direct you to some work that has been done by the Transition Pathway Initiative. You can find the reference on page 101 of the report. Which compares the decarbonization rate of companies in different sectors compared to the decarbonization rate within their targets. So it's targets generally, it's not science-based targets. And they find that there is a wide difference across sectors. So in their specific results, the paper and electric utilities are overperforming their targets over the time horizon looked at. And other sectors such as the auto, shipping, oil and gas, cement and steel are underperforming. But I invite you to look at this very interesting piece of research. Is on page 101 of the report. You will find the graph and the reference and the source so that you can go see in the Transition Pathway Initiative work.
An interesting and tough questions from Laura. If you could choose a specific aspect to improve time horizon, sector coverage, what would you suggest, basically?
That's a very difficult question. Thank you, Laura. For me, scope 3 is one of the most important aspects. Those who know me know that I've been screaming this message for the last 5 years. So I think that scope 3, at least for a huge number of sectors, is feasible. Of course, there are some issues and data availability problems, but at the moment it's still feasible. So this is one. Perhaps the second is that for me, a temperature alignment methodology should be cumulative. So, if we are to follow the logic of the Paris Agreement and of the climate models of the IPCC, the logic is that we have a remaining carbon budget. And, we have this remaining carbon budget. And if we overshoot this carbon budget, we are going to have increases in temperature much higher than what we want. After how we distribute this budget across time, across geography, across sector, that's another issue. But so methodologies that only look at the distance between climate performance of portfolios, let's say in 2025 versus what it should be in 2025, they do not see what happens before or after. So it's interesting in itself, but it's just a different question. It just says in 2025, where are we? So if this is the question that we are trying to answer, then it's good. But for me, if you are to assess alignment with the temperature objective of the agreement, you need to respect the budget perspective and therefore have the assessment made over several years cumulatively.
Question: given the spread in the results, can we have any confidence in the methodology used today? And what should be the lesson for investors really try to comply with SDGs?
I think the lesson for investors is to really try to understand what you are buying. Once again, there is no good or bad methodology. Every methodology that we reviewed, they are good in themselves. They just answer different questions. And you need to understand the specific question it answers. And when I say specific question, it's not, ooh, it captures the risk, or ooh, it captures alignment. No, you need to be specific. A 2-degree aligned portfolio is a portfolio where companies scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions decarbonize at this specific rate, and this is the implication of using that methodology. Actually, in the appendix of the report, you have a detailed review of each method and the key conditions that need to be reunited to be considered 2-degree aligned, in those methods. So it shows the assessment question each method's answer. So I think investors need to understand this and also disclose this, when disclosing an implied temperature rise or an alignment metric in a report.
Liz has lots of questions, but I think you raised your hand. Do you want to ask your question physically, Liz, about tropic? And it's not called tropic anymore, but the SBT CDP method. Christelle, can we give the floor to Liz? Otherwise, I will ask the question.
I did.
Yes, two Liz's, and I'm sorry, we're both working with AXA, so okay. I think that question was from Liz Moret, if she's still on the code, not from me. I had some other questions.
I'm sorry. Okay, I'm changed.
Well, you can ask a question if you have one now, Liz.
Yeah, I was just going to ask, how did you measure, or some way of measuring, how the temperatures models that you've reviewed are really different from just using a carbon footprint absolute reduction, and how much difference do you think there should be between the two?
Yes, so indeed, in the report, I looked at the linear correlation between the implied temperature score of companies and their carbon footprint, both scope 1 and 2, and also scope 3, and also scope 1, 2, and 3. I did not compare the rate of change because I didn't have access to the data, but I agree with you that it would be interesting. But I still looked at the correlation between the two, and the results was that the correlations are very low, and in some instances negative. So there is a detailed table in the report where you will find all the results for the methodology. And I actually think that it's normal and that it's healthy that it's different, just because carbon footprinting, it's a static and even, as we often say, backward-looking indicator, whereas temperature alignment methodologies are meant to capture the forward-looking performance. So it's quite reassuring that the two, and expected that the two are not correlated.
Yeah, I suppose I agree with that. Also, I think that is one of the difficulty for the industry, because people can talk about carbon footprint with companies, people have started understanding carbon footprint, and suddenly you have a very big jump. So I think the translation from past to forward is one of the most important steps for people going forward.
Yeah, I agree completely.
Lisa Moret.
Yes, can you hear me now? Okay, thank you very much. So first of all, congratulations to ALB and Julie Reynaud, I4C, and everyone involved in this report. It's really very interesting. So my question is about the topic of benchmarking. And I think in particular of the sort of carbon budget apportioning, we would need to process, let's say, to calculate this implied temperature at company level. And I would say that, well, this is my perspective because we worked quite a lot on this at AXAM, but I would say that this is the key element, or this is one of the key elements that is the most challenging, because in order to better apportion global carbon budget at company level, first we have the question of what is the percentage of the overall economy we are covering, focusing on one specific listed universe. And then there, I mean, it is not that easy to calculate that. And second, there is the question of, once we have calibrated the overall GHG emission, for listed universe, then we need to apportion this at company level, taking into account various dimensions. So I asked a question to Stefan if you reviewed the carbon delta methodology, but without, let's say, bringing a secret sauce of that is the ownership of MSCI. What we could say is that carbon delta is using a kind of top-down approach, where they will apportion the carbon budget at company level using kind of risk factors like sector, region, country, split of revenues, etc., etc. But again, I think that one thing that could be very helpful is that either, let's say, a national accounting system can help financial markets by mapping their sector nomenclature, or let's say typology, with the one we are using in financial markets. Or maybe it's a question for the academics. I don't know, but what is your perspective on that? And do you think that we could improve the implied temperature methodology by refining this question of the apportioning, and again, potentially put some academic resource on that, because I think this is the key challenge here.
Yes, I could not agree more. At the moment, most methodology developers, so not carbon delta, but most others, will use models and scenario models that do the apportioning for them. So the IEA, for example, similar to a grandfathering model and does the apportioning based on the cost efficiency hypothesis, for example. But we do see a number of providers, so including Carbon Delta, but we can also cite the work of Beyond Rating,
exactly.
For example, that are developing their own model to test different ways of allocating the budget to different time and geography and sectors. Perhaps one thing to note is that one of the things we discuss in the report is that if we wanted an approach that really seeks to align to the temperature goal of the Paris Agreement, it would be better to use the nationally determined contributions of countries as the geographical pathway where possible. The problem is, as many of you know, is if we sum those NDCs, the UNEP gap report find that we are on a 3.2 degree track, and then others find 3 or 3.4, depends on the hypothesis you take, but at least we find that it's not on a 2 degree track, so we cannot use the NDCs in their current state to build a nationally determined global cross-sector 2 degree reference scenario. So this is also one of the difficulties we have in that respect. So I completely agree that there is a lot of space for academic work in that space, and indeed.
Thank you, Liz, for your question, and I think that's actually a very good transition to close this webinar and to mention that there will be a last webinar this Friday, which will be more focused on academic issue and scientific issues, and we will try to dig. Peter will be in charge, and we'll try to dig into these issues that we highlighted today. So you can come back to us on Friday, and you can register through the ILB website if you haven't done so. So there will be some similar aspect of the presentation, but as I said, we will dig more into some issues. Thank you, all of you, for your questions. Thank you all for all the participants, Anne-Claire, Alice, Hugo and Clément, and Julie, of course. And again, as we say, thank you for all the providers that have been very proactive in responding and to this test. We couldn't have done it without them. So great work, and see you on Friday with Peter. Bye-bye, everyone.
Thanks, Stefan. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye, everyone. Thank you.
Il y a des questions que on n'a pas répondu.
Right on time. Une question sur SBT, mais